The 38-Minute War. Why Zanzibar surrendered before the tea was cold. At 9:02 a.m. on August 27, 1896, the British Royal Navy opened fire on the Sultan's palace in Zanzibar harbor. Shells screamed through the tropical morning air, smashing into the ornate wooden structure. The palace's defenders fired back with whatever weapons they had. Antiquated cannons, small arms, even the Sultan's yacht with its single gun. It was a hopelessly one-sided fight. By 9:40 a.m., it was over. In exactly 38 minutes, the British had bombarded the palace into submission, killed or wounded approximately 500 Zanzibari defenders, sunk the Sultan's yacht, and decisively ended what would become known as the shortest war in recorded history. British casualties: one sailor slightly wounded. The Anglo-Zanzibar War wasn't really a war at all. It was an execution, a brutal demonstration of colonial power, and a grim illustration of what happened when anyone challenged the British Empire at the height of its dominance. The conflict lasted barely long enough to brew a proper pot of tea, yet it changed the course of Zanzibar's history and provided a textbook example of Victorian gunboat diplomacy at its most ruthless. This is the story of how a succession dispute in an island sultanate off the coast of East Africa escalated into the world's shortest war, and what that war reveals about empire, power, and the deadly efficiency of 19th century naval artillery. The jewel of the Swahili coast. To understand the 38-Minute War, you need to understand Zanzibar, an island that was far more important in the 19th century than most people today realize. Zanzibar lies about 25 miles off the coast of what is now Tanzania in East Africa. For centuries, it had been a crucial center of Indian Ocean trade, a cosmopolitan crossroads where Arab, Persian, Indian, and African merchants mingled. The island was famous for its cloves, which grew nowhere else in such abundance, its strategic location on trade routes, and, darkest of all, its role as the largest slave trading center on the East African coast. By the 1890s, Zanzibar was technically independent under its sultan, but in reality, it was a British protectorate. Britain had spent decades gradually asserting control over the island, motivated by a mix of commercial interests, strategic concerns about other European powers, and a genuine abolitionist desire to end the slave trade, though this humanitarian impulse coexisted uncomfortably with Britain's own imperial exploitation. The arrangement was typical of British informal empire. Zanzibar had its own sultan, its own flag, and the appearance of sovereignty. But British advisors controlled foreign policy. A British consul general essentially ran the government, and Royal Navy ships enforced Britain's will. The Sultan was a puppet who survived only as long as he did what he was told. Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini understood this arrangement and generally cooperated with British authorities. He had ruled since 1893 under British supervision, accepted British guidance on most matters, and kept Zanzibar stable and profitable. From Britain's perspective, he was the ideal client ruler, sufficiently prestigious to legitimize British control, sufficiently compliant to never challenge it. Then, on August 25, 1896, Sultan Hamad died suddenly. The circumstances were suspicious. He may have been poisoned, but what mattered was that Zanzibar now needed a new sultan, and not everyone agreed on who that should be. The wrong man takes the throne. According to the 1886 treaty between Britain and Zanzibar, the succession required British approval. The British preferred Hamoud bin Mohammed, a candidate they believed would continue the cooperative relationship. He was moderate, pro-British, and unlikely to cause problems. But Khalid bin Barghash had other ideas. Khalid was a cousin of the late Sultan and had his own claim to the throne based on traditional succession rules that the British treaty had superseded. He was also far more independent-minded than Britain wanted. He had already clashed with British authorities over various issues and was known to harbor anti-British sentiments. From the British perspective, he was exactly the wrong person to become Sultan. On August 25th, within hours of Hamad's death, Khalid made his move. He gathered armed supporters, including members of the palace guard loyal to him, and occupied the Sultan's palace. He declared himself Sultan and began consolidating control. It was a fait accompli. He was in the palace, had armed men, and claimed the throne by right of succession. The British Consul General, Basil Cave, was appalled. This was a direct challenge to British authority. Khalid had seized the throne without permission in violation of the treaty and seemed prepared to assert genuine independence rather than serving as a British puppet. Cave immediately sent Khalid an ultimatum: vacate the palace by 9 a.m. on August 27th or face the consequences. Khalid, confident in his position and perhaps underestimating British resolve, refused. He fortified the palace, gathered more armed supporters, and prepared to defend his claim. He was about to receive a devastating lesson in the reality of colonial power. The British prepare for war Basil Cave didn't have the authority to start a war on his own, but he had something almost as good: Rear Admiral Harry Rawson and the Royal Navy's Cape and East Africa Station. Admiral Rawson commanded 3 cruisers and 2 gunboats that happened to be in the area: HMS St. George, HMS Philomel, HMS Thrush, HMS Raccoon, and HMS Sparrow. These weren't the Royal Navy's most powerful ships. Those were deployed in more strategically important waters, but they were more than sufficient for the task at hand. British warships of the 1890s represented the apex of Victorian naval technology. They carried rifled naval guns that could fire shells with devastating accuracy over miles of distance. They had professional crews trained to fire those guns with mechanical precision, and they were armored against the kind of return fire that Zanzibar could possibly muster. Facing this naval might, Khalid's forces were pathetically inadequate. The palace had some old artillery pieces, mostly ceremonial cannons that hadn't been fired in anger for decades. Khalid's supporters had rifles and small arms. The palace guard numbered around 2,800 men, impressive in local terms, but they were lightly armed irregulars facing professional naval bombardment. Khalid did have one actual warship, the HHS Glasgow, a wooden yacht that had been presented to a previous sultan and was technically the Zanzibar Navy. It mounted one gun and flew the Zanzibar flag. Against the British fleet, it was less a warship than a floating target. As August 27th approached, Admiral Rawson positioned his ships in Zanzibar harbor with careful precision. The cruisers were placed to provide overlapping fields of fire on the palace. The gunboats were positioned to engage the Glasgow and prevent any escape by sea. Royal Marines were readied for a landing operation if bombardment wasn't sufficient. The Admiral also contacted British citizens and friendly foreign nationals in Zanzibar, advising them to stay away from the palace area and seek shelter. This was going to be messy, and Rawson wanted no British civilians caught in the crossfire. Everything was ready. The ultimatum expired at 9 a.m. At 9:02, having given Khalid 2 extra minutes to surrender, Admiral Rawson gave the order to open fire. 38 minutes of hell. The bombardment began with devastating efficiency. British gunners had already calculated ranges and trajectories. Their first salvos hit the palace with precision, smashing through wooden walls and setting fires. The palace, for all its ornate beauty, was essentially a large wooden building. It offered almost no protection against naval artillery. Return fire from the palace was sporadic and ineffective. The old cannons couldn't match the range of British guns, and when they did fire, their shots fell harmlessly into the harbor or sailed over the British ships. Small arms fire from the palace rattled off the armored hulls of British vessels without causing damage. The Glasgow, Zanzibar's lone warship, actually put up a fight. Its crew fired their single gun at the British fleet, attempting to defend their Sultan's claim. It was an act of either extraordinary bravery or extraordinary futility, probably both. Within minutes, focused fire from HMS Philomel and HMS Thrush hit the yacht repeatedly. The Glasgow began taking water, listing badly, and finally sank in the harbor at 9:07 a.m., just 5 minutes into the battle. Inside the palace, conditions rapidly became nightmarish. Shells exploded in the wooden structure, starting fires that spread quickly in the tropical heat. Defenders were killed by direct hits, by flying debris, or by the fires. The noise was overwhelming. The crash of shells, the screams of wounded men, the roar of flames. Khalid, realizing his position was hopeless, attempted to organize a defense but quickly understood that defense was impossible. You cannot fight a naval bombardment with rifles. You cannot extinguish fires faster than they're being started by explosive shells. The palace was being systematically destroyed around him. British observers noted that the Zanzibari defenders showed considerable courage. They continued trying to return fire even as their positions were obliterated. But courage was irrelevant against the overwhelming technological and firepower advantage the British possessed. By 9:30 a.m., less than half an hour into the bombardment, the palace was a burning ruin. Casualties among the defenders were mounting horrifically. Later estimates suggested around 500 killed or wounded out of approximately 2,800 defenders. The palace's guns had been silenced. Fires raged unchecked. The battle, such as it was effectively over. At 9:40 a.m., Admiral Rawson ordered a ceasefire. The bombardment had lasted exactly 38 minutes. The aftermath of the shortest war. As smoke cleared from the harbor, the destruction was evident. The Sultan's palace, one of Zanzibar's most impressive buildings, was a smoldering wreck. Bodies littered the palace grounds. The Glasgow lay on the harbor bottom. The smell of gunpowder, smoke, and death hung over the waterfront. Khalid bin Barghash had fled. At some point during the bombardment, accounts vary on exactly when, he escaped from the palace and made his way to the German consulate, where he claimed asylum. Germany, which had colonial interest in East Africa and occasionally clashed with Britain over influence, granted him protection. This created a diplomatic complication. Britain demanded Khalid be handed over to face consequences for his rebellion. Germany refused, not wanting to establish a precedent of surrendering asylum seekers. The standoff lasted for days until a compromise was reached. Khalid would be exiled to German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, rather than facing British justice. He lived there for the next 2 years before eventually being allowed to move to Mombasa, where he died in 1927. With Khalid gone, the British moved quickly to install their preferred candidate. Hamud bin Muhammad was proclaimed Sultan on August 27th, mere hours after the bombardment ended. He was crowned in a ceremony carefully stage-managed by British authorities, and he immediately signed documents confirming British control over Zanzibar's foreign affairs, military, and finances. The message was clear. Britain chose who ruled Zanzibar, and anyone who challenged that choice would be destroyed with overwhelming force and brutal efficiency. Counting the cost, the disparity in casualties tells the story of the war more clearly than any narrative description could. Zanzibar, approximately 500 killed or wounded. Exact numbers were never definitively established. 1 warship sunk. The Sultan's palace destroyed, national treasury looted to pay for damages. Political independence permanently ended Britain. 1 sailor slightly wounded, reportedly by debris, not enemy fire. Minimal ammunition expended, no ships damaged. Complete strategic victory achieved. It's difficult to even call this a war in any meaningful sense. It was a punitive expedition, a demonstration of power, a 38-minute advertisement for the consequences of challenging the British Empire. The financial cost to Zanzibar was substantial, beyond the immediate casualties. The British demanded reparations for the rebellion, requiring Zanzibar to pay for the ammunition expended in destroying the palace. This was standard imperial practice, making the colonized pay for their own subjugation. But it added economic insult to military injury, the technology of empire. The Anglo-Zanzibar War perfectly illustrated the technological gulf that enabled European imperial domination in the late 19th century. British naval guns in 1896 could fire shells accurately over several miles using precision optics and mathematical fire control calculations. The shells themselves were explosive projectiles designed to maximize damage. The ships were armored against return fire and could maintain sustained bombardment for hours if necessary. Against this technology, Zanzibar had antique smoothbore cannons, small arms, and a wooden palace. The technological mismatch was so extreme that the outcome was never in doubt. The only question was how long it would take. This technological gap existed across Africa, Asia, and other regions colonized by European powers in the 19th century. Local rulers might have larger armies in terms of raw numbers, but European forces had rifles, machine guns, artillery, telegraphs, railroads, and steamships. These advantages meant that relatively small European forces could dominate much larger indigenous populations through superior firepower and logistics. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was an extreme example, but the pattern was common. When local powers challenged European colonial authority, they were crushed with industrial-age military technology that made resistance futile. The witnesses. The bombardment was witnessed by numerous civilians, British, Arab, Indian, and African, who watched from buildings around the harbor. Several accounts survive, describing the spectacle with varying degrees of horror and awe. British civilians generally supported the action, viewing it as necessary to maintain order and protect British interests. Some even treated it as entertainment, watches from rooftops as the palace burned. The local population was more ambivalent. Many had no particular loyalty to Khalid, but seeing their sultan's palace destroyed by foreign warships was humiliating and frightening. It was a vivid demonstration of Zanzibar's subordinate status and the futility of resistance. Foreign journalists and diplomats documented the event with the neutral language of official reports, but reading between the lines, you can sense their shock at the disproportionate force employed. Even by the standards of 1890's colonialism, when European powers regularly used violence to maintain control, the Anglo-Zanzibar War stood out for its sheer one-sidedness. Photographs exist of the destroyed palace, haunting images of splintered wood, collapsed walls, and debris scattered across the palace grounds. These are among the earliest combat photographs from Africa, providing visual documentation of colonial violence that was more commonly recorded only in written reports. The imperial logic. To modern sensibilities, the British response seems grotesquely disproportionate. A succession dispute in a client state was resolved with naval bombardment that killed hundreds of people. The overwhelming force seems like overkill, the casualties excessive, the entire operation brutal and unnecessary. But from the British imperial perspective of 1896, the action made perfect sense, even seemed moderate and restrained. Britain controlled a global empire that depended on a reputation for overwhelming force. If challenges to British authority were tolerated in Zanzibar, other client states might get similar ideas. The entire system of informal empire, where Britain controlled foreign territories through local proxies rather than direct administration, depended on the credible threat of violence. The 38-minute bombardment wasn't really about Zanzibar at all. It was a message to every other ruler in British-influenced territory: comply with our demands or be destroyed. The speed and decisiveness were features, not bugs. They demonstrated that British power was so overwhelming that resistance was literally pointless. Moreover, from the British view, they had shown considerable restraint. Admiral Rawson gave Khalid a clear ultimatum and time to surrender. He warned civilians to evacuate the area. The bombardment was precisely targeted at the palace rather than the city as a whole. In the calculus of 1890's imperialism, this was measured and proportionate force. Of course, this logic only makes sense if you accept the fundamental premise that Britain had the right to control Zanzibar's succession and government in the first place, a premise that the Zanzibaris themselves had little say in establishing. Zanzibar under the British. After the 38-minute war, Zanzibar settled into its role as a British protectorate with no illusions about independence. Sultan Khalid bin Muhammad ruled as the British wanted, implementing their policies and accepting their advisors' decisions. The British abolished slavery in Zanzibar. It had technically been abolished earlier, but enforcement was now absolute. Reorganized the government along British administrative lines, and integrated Zanzibar more fully into the British colonial economic system. Clove production remained the primary export, now controlled by British and Indian merchants under British supervision. For the next 6 decades, Zanzibar's history was essentially a footnote to British colonial history. Sultans came and went, but real power resided with the British resident, as the consul general was now titled. During both world wars, Zanzibar contributed resources and manpower to British military efforts, having no real choice in the matter. It wasn't until 1963 that Zanzibar gained independence from Britain, and even then, independence was short-lived. In 1964, a revolution overthrew the Sultan, and Zanzibar merged with Tanganyika to form Tanzania. The Sultanate that had existed for centuries ended permanently, a victim of anti-colonial movements that swept Africa in the 1960s. Today, Zanzibar is a semi-autonomous region within Tanzania, known primarily as a tourist destination famous for its beaches, spice plantations, and historic stone town. The Sultan's palace has been reconstructed and is now a museum. Few visitors are aware that they're walking through the site of the shortest war in history. The record that still stands. The Anglo-Zanzibar War's 38-minute duration remains the record for the shortest war in history. No other recorded conflict comes close. Most short wars are measured in days or weeks. 38 minutes is in a category by itself. Various other brief conflicts have been proposed as challengers to this record. The Six-Day War, Israel versus Arab states, 1967, lasted, as the name suggests, 6 days. The Football War, Honduras versus El Salvador, 1969, lasted about 100 hours. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1971 lasted 13 days. Compared to these conflicts, the Anglo-Zanzibar War wasn't just shorter. It was shorter by orders of magnitude. You could barely finish breakfast in 38 minutes, let alone conduct a military campaign. The brevity reflects both British military superiority and the limited objectives. Britain wasn't trying to conquer territory or defeat armies in the field. It was simply removing an uncooperative ruler and installing a compliant one. With overwhelming naval firepower positioned in the harbor and a clear target, the palace, the operation could be completed with brutal efficiency. Lessons and legacy. What does the 38-minute war teach us? Several things, depending on your perspective. About colonial power. Imperial control rested ultimately on violence and the credible threat of violence. The veneer of treaties, advisors, and diplomatic niceties masked the fundamental reality that Britain ruled through superior firepower. About technological advantage, the gap between industrial and pre-industrial military technology was so vast that numerical superiority became irrelevant. A few modern warships could destroy forces hundreds of times larger if those forces lacked equivalent technology. About the nature of protectorates, the fiction of independence that characterized British protectorates was just that, fiction. When a protected state attempted to exercise actual sovereignty, it was violently reminded of the reality. About historical memory, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is remembered primarily as a curiosity, the shortest war, rather than as a colonial atrocity. The hundreds of Zanzibari dead are footnotes to the quirky record, a reminder of how colonial violence is often trivialized in historical narratives. About resistance. Even hopeless resistance happened. Khalid's decision to defy Britain and his defenders' decision to fight even when defeat was certain represented a refusal to accept subjugation without at least attempting to assert sovereignty. That this resistance was crushed in 38 minutes doesn't make it any less significant as an act of defiance. Conclusion. The war shorter than tea time. The Anglo-Zanzibar War lasted 38 minutes, less time than it takes to brew and drink a pot of tea, as British observers noted with grim humor. In that brief span, the British Empire demonstrated its power, crushed a challenge to its authority, installed a compliant puppet ruler, and sent a message that echoed across every colonial territory. Don't resist. The war wasn't really about Zanzibar, just as the 38-minute bombardment wasn't really about Khalid bin Barghash. It was about maintaining an empire that stretched across a quarter of the world's surface, an empire that ultimately rested not on consent or cooperation, but on the willingness to use overwhelming violence against anyone who challenged British control. Sultan Khalid bin Barghash lost his throne before he could finish his morning routines. 500 of his defenders were killed or wounded in less time than most battles take to begin. The palace that had stood for generations was reduced to smoking ruins between breakfast and mid-morning tea. The Anglo-Zanzibar War stands as the shortest war in history, a grim record that reflects not the glory of quick victory, but the brutal efficiency of colonial violence and the terrible mathematics of technological disparity. In 38 minutes, the British proved they could destroy a sultanate faster than most people could walk a mile. It remains, more than a century later, the definitive answer to the question, what's the shortest war in history? And behind that curious record lies a story of empire, power, and the hundreds of forgotten casualties who died in less time than it takes to finish your morning tea.